Today I made a comment on someone's Facebook page, and it got me thinking back when I went to Florida. I was in the military. I was stationed at Biloxi, Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi. When I arrived in West Palm Beach, I was only 17, and I turned 18 while I was at West Palm Beach. And then I received orders to go to Orlando Air Force Base. I can't remember the day that I arrived at Orlando, but it was in 1957. It was January 1957. And I loved Florida. Orlando at that time, this is before Disneyland, or is it Disney World? Disney World. Disneyland's in California. But this is before Kissimmee and Disney World opened up. We used to go down to Kissimmee to the drag races. And to show you how much this was ancient history, Don Garlett was there the Saturday that I went to the drag races at Kissimmee. It was held at the airport. They had a pretty good-sized flight line down there. They had used that runway for training during the Second World War. And on the weekends, they had drag races. And Don Garlett was there. He held the world's record at the time, and it was under 170 miles per hour. So that's how much ancient history that is. And he was running a Chrysler engine in that dragster that he had built. And Kissimmee at that time was so remote. Of course, they had concession stands, people selling hot dogs and things like that. But if you wanted to get something to eat after the drag race was over, very few restaurants in the area. And what we would usually do is find a little mom and pop grocery store, go in and buy bread and bologna. I had this friend that I ran around with, and he was from up north. And on one of those days, we were going to get something to eat, and we stopped in front of this little grocery store. And I said, well, what we need to do is get us some Vienna sausage. He said, what in the world is Vienna sausage? And I said, you know, those little cans. He said, Frank, that's Vienna sausage. So that's how much of a hillbilly I was. Of course, I never did have an inferiority complex. So it didn't bother me. After that, I called it Vienna sausage. But back in the early 50s, when I grew up in this area, it was a different time. Sometimes I think back, and it's almost hard to believe how things have changed. That's the only advantage of being the age I am now. And growing up in East Tennessee, it was just a different time. Our entertainment was birthday parties, going to the movies. We would go to the theater on Saturday, and they had a double feature. It was always a Western, like Johnny Mac Brown, Lash LaRue, Gene Autry, and some of those old Western stars. They would have a double feature, and you'd pay your admission, and you could stay in there as long as you wanted to. You could just watch them over and over, which I usually did. And after sitting in that theater for sometimes 4 hours, when you came out into the open, you could hardly see. The sun would blind you. But that was a good time to grow up. I'm trying to think, when I started this video, I really didn't have a subject that I was going to talk about. Sometimes it's not the easiest thing to do to sit down in front of a camera. But when I left home, I was 17. I joined the United States Air Force, and my dad, he had to sign the papers for it to be legal for them to let me come into the military. And that's the only time that I ever saw my father cry, is when he signed those papers. My father was born in 1893, and he was in the First World War. He worked in the hospital in San Antonio. I think they called it, I don't know if they called it Kelly Field. I can't remember. But anyway, he was stationed and worked in the Army Hospital at Kelly. When I was at Lackland going through basic training, Kelly was Kelly Air Force Base. And when my dad worked in the hospital there at the Army base, that's when they had the pandemic, the flu pandemic. I think it was 1918. And I remember my father talking about that pandemic, and he said that they had so many military guys to pass away from the flu that they were having problems finding mortuary space. I know that's not a good subject, but it's history. And if you study that pandemic, it was really a traumatic thing. And some of the things that I have read about that pandemic, especially in this area, some children became orphans almost overnight because their parents had the flu, and a lot of them passed away, and the children were left without a mother and dad in a lot of areas. And now some of this is just a paraphrase of my father. This is going to be a long video. You can watch it or not watch it. I'm going to give you a little bit of history. My dad, he said that when he was a young boy, they had houses separated from the population. It was usually up in the woods. And people who had smallpox, they sent them to live in this area. And people who had survived or had the smallpox and had an immunity to it worked there and maintained the facilities. So that's the way things have changed. My dad worked in the coal mines. He was a coal miner when I was born. He was a part of when the United Mine Workers formed a union. And I can remember my mother and dad talking about that event. And back in those days, the mining camps, my mother used to tell me about this, and I'm going to tell you what happened to my dad. They had what they called, my mother called them gun thugs. I was born in 1938, but this was previous to when I was born. My mother said that the gun thug, if someone didn't show up for work, they would go to their house and mistreat them and just all kinds of things. And my dad was telling me about this one mining area. My dad was a pretty clever individual. And my dad had this old car. And back then, part of the road went through the creek. But he was going through the creek, and the engine quit, and he was sitting there blocking the route to come through the creek. And this gun thug came along riding a horse. And there my dad sat. And the gun thug said, "I tell you what, mister," he said, "if you don't get that car out of the creek, I'm going to take it away from you." Like I say, my dad was clever. And you know what my dad said? He said, "Well, if you take it, you won't make you won't make me take it back when you find out you don't want it, will you?" And he said the guy almost fell off the horse laughing. And he never had any problems with that guy. And everybody, had a mortal fear of that gun thug. But that was clever that my dad did that. Now this is a rambling video. But anyway, when I left to go in the Air Force, I guess the city where I went to meet the recruiter was no more than 40 miles away. And they used to have these little bus lines that ran between these small towns. And I caught a bus, and it took me 3 or 4 hours to go 40 miles. And I joined the Air Force at 17, and they took us in this little room to swear us in. And they had a day room right off of the room where we were sworn in. And they had some guys sitting around in there. I don't know if they were waiting to be sworn in or just whatever. But they had a radio, and it was playing. And after we were sworn in, I walked out into the day room, and Dean Martin was singing "Memories Are Made of This." And I'll never forget that song. So, as always, hurry up and wait. So they said, "We're going to put you on a bus and take you to McGee-Tyson to catch an airplane to go to Texas, Lackland Air Force Base in Texas." So we got there about 11 o'clock in the morning, and we waited and we waited. And just as the sun was starting to go down, I believe it was Texas Airways flew a C-47 in there and picked us up. So when we left Knoxville, it was dark. So the only thing you could see, of course, I loved airplanes, and it was a big deal getting to fly, especially, well, it wasn't a big deal on a C-47 because back then a C-47 wasn't really a big deal, but now it is because they're still flying that aircraft. And they used that on D-Day to drop most of the paratroopers into France, the C-47s. And there's a lot of them still in use today. And I think some guys used to fly a C-47 out of Morristown, I think. I think they carried freight. And they would come over our house about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And the way those radials resonate off of the fuselage of a C-47, I can hear one and I know instantly that it's a C-47 because it has its own unique sound. But anyway, that's what we flew into Lackland Air Force Base in Texas on a C-47. And we were in a mixed flight. That's what they called it back then. We were Flight 41. And most of the people on our C-47 were from Chattanooga, Knoxville, and the surrounding area. And then, shortly after we landed, there was a C-46 came in. And that was an aircraft they used in the Second World War. And it had the remainder of Flight 41, and most of those guys were out of the north, Michigan, New York, in that area. So you can imagine the conflicts that arose between a bunch of hillbillies and a bunch of Yankees. But we developed friendships there. And then when I left, I didn't stay. The training was 3 months, and I was going into a special assignment, so I either stayed 4 weeks or 6 weeks and transferred out, and they sent me over to Kelly Air Force Base, and I caught a C-54, which was also one of the aircraft they used in the Berlin airlift. And then we caught a bus to Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi. And then I caught a Greyhound bus into West Palm Beach. I caught a Greyhound bus to Orlando. And when I transferred to Orlando, while I was there, this automobile pulled up. And this tech sergeant got out. And he said, "Come with me, I'm your assignment." And they had a desk for me, and they said, "This is your desk, and this is your job." And I handled any bill that came in from a civilian contractor. I kept all those records, and it came to me. And I would submit the paperwork to the Air Force until they could be paid. Among some other duties that was part of the admin job. And I kept that job for the 3 years that I was at Orlando. We had a missile squadron that was stationed there at Orlando Air Force Base. But they were different from the squadron that I was in. We were more or less support for that missile squadron. And they had a unit move, and I took care of all their paperwork. What they would do is they would go unaccompanied to the new assignment, and then if they were of certain rank, their dependents could come over. So I took care of all their paperwork, made sure that their dependents didn't have any problems with getting their household goods stored or shipped. Make sure that the dependents that were going to travel to the foreign country, that they had all of their reservations on the airlines. Anything that we could do in support of that missile squadron, we did. And I made a lot of friends doing that. And one day I was sitting at my desk, and this colonel came in, and I sat near the door to the building where you came in, and I said, "Could I help you, Colonel?" And he said, "I'm looking for Airman." He said my name. And he said, "You know, I really appreciate all the work you did for my men. And you'll probably have to clear this with your commander. But what we're going to do is we're going to test fire one of the first MACE missiles from a mobile launch pad from Cape Canaveral. And I want you to be my special guest for that launch." Well, I mean, he was speaking my language. I thought that was great. And he said, "You check with your OIC, who was a captain." So I went in and told him, I said, "There's a colonel out there that's invited me to go with him to Cape Canaveral to witness the firing of one of their missiles, their MACE missile. But I need authorization to go." And he said, "Well, what do you need, you know?" And the colonel said, "Well, you need some kind of a written permission." So he just got a pen and just and handed it to me. He said, "This is your permission. You go." So I was at Cape Canaveral when they launched one of the first MACE missiles from Cape Canaveral on a mobile launch pad. While we were there, we had a communications truck and we had a blockhouse. I call it a blockhouse. And down on the beach, the mobile launcher was sitting down there with the MACE missile on it. And we had a communication van sitting beside the blockhouse. And I don't know how far away it was. I've done some research, and I think it was a Titan missile, and I think it was one of the first Titans ever launched from Cape Canaveral, and it looked like it was really too close to us, to tell you the truth. And I was listening to the communications people in the van, and of course, I guess you could call me a VIP. I had nothing to do but observe, and that's what I was doing. But I could hear the communications with the communications truck. And the people who were doing the countdown of the Titan, I could hear them talking to the command truck, and they told them, they said, "You're going to have to hold your countdown on your MACE missile because we're going to launch this Titan." So, okay. So I could hear the countdown for the Titan, and it was like 10, 9, 8. And when that thing fired, if it had exploded, it would have wiped every one of us out. That was the loudest sound I have ever heard in my life. So the Titan fired, and we went back down to the countdown on the MACE missile. If we have any former, of course, if you were in that squadron, you'd be an old guy right now, you know, because at this time, I was close to 21. This was in October of 1959. And I got out on my first enlistment in January 60. So anyway, the countdown continued for the MACE missile. And by this time, I was setting up on top of the blockhouse because I wanted to really get a good view of this thing, and it was down there, I don't know how far, close enough to you could see it real well, sitting on a mobile launcher. But what we didn't know, and the MACE missile, you can Google it, it looked like an airplane, and it was launched with a JADO bottle. And it would launch, and as soon as it got launched, it would drop the JADO bottle and then fly, and it had swept wings. I don't think it was supersonic. But what we didn't know is circulating around over on Cocoa Beach was an F-100. And his job was to chase that thing. And if it went off course, to make sure if they didn't just hit a destruct button, he'd shoot the thing down. And I'm sure when he was circulating around over there, he saw us guys sitting on top of that blockhouse. So they went through the countdown, the JATO bottle fired, and the Mace missile started up. And this F-100 came over our head. I bet he wasn't 50 feet above our blockhouse that we were on. And he was going so fast that he was going to outrun the missile, and he had to swing off to the left or right to keep from outrunning it. But you can imagine, we were sitting there on that blockhouse, and an F-100 just screaming, going right across. I mean, I thought everything had exploded. But I'm thankful I had the opportunity to experience some of those events. And, I mean, it's a great memory to have. I could go on, but I'm trying to see how long this thing has been going on. Too long. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.